The rain came down in sheets over the small rural town, a relentless curtain of gray that turned the unpaved roads into rivers of mud. It was the kind of cold, biting rain that seeped into your bones and made you question why you ever left the house. For the men and women of the Army transport convoy, it was just another miserable day in a long string of miserable days. They were young, mostly, filled with the swagger and authority that came with the uniform, but also with the impatience of youth. They had a schedule to keep, supplies to move, and this weather was doing them no favors. The convoy of heavy trucks rumbled down the main street, their massive tires churning the road into a quagmire. The townsfolk, used to the military presence, mostly stayed inside, watching the spectacle from behind rain-streaked windows. But one figure stood defiantly in the middle of the chaos: Sarah Jensen. Sarah wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a politician or a protester. She was a 58-year-old grandmother, a retired school teacher who had lived in this town her entire life. Her husband of 35 years, a gentleman named David, had passed away 2 years ago, leaving her alone in the big house at the edge of town where they had raised their 3 children. Her life was simple now, tending to her overgrown garden, reading mystery novels, and walking into town every day to check her P.O. box, even though she rarely got anything but circulars. To the soldiers, she was just an old woman in their way. The lead truck in the convoy had to slow to a crawl as Sarah, hunched against the rain with a worn umbrella, stepped off the curb to cross the street. The driver, a young corporal from Texas with a face full of freckles and a chip on his shoulder, leaned on his horn. The blast was deafening, meant to scatter anyone foolish enough to be near the road. But Sarah, startled, lost her footing on the slick cobblestone. She didn't fall, but she stumbled, dropping her umbrella into the gutter. A burst of laughter came from the cab of the truck behind. A sergeant, a burly man with a crew cut, stuck his head out the window. "Hey, Grandma, learn to swim!" he yelled over the roar of the engines. Another soldier, a private first class hoping to impress his comrades, went a step further. As Sarah bent to retrieve her sodden umbrella, he leaned out and made a rude gesture. "Get off the road! Go take a bath in your kitchen!" But the cruelty didn't end with words. As the convoy began to move again, one of the trucks swerved slightly, its massive wheel hitting a deep puddle. A wave of thick, brown, oily mud arced through the air like a breaking wave and crashed directly onto Sarah. It splattered across her back, caked her white hair, and soaked through her thin coat. She stood there, frozen, absolutely covered from head to toe in filth. The soldiers in the trucks hooted and hollered, some clapping as if it were a great joke. To them, it was just another day of blowing off steam. To Sarah, it was a moment of utter, freezing, humiliating shock. She didn't move for a full minute. The rain continued to pelt her, mixing with the mud and creating dirty rivulets that ran down her face. She wasn't crying. She was too stunned for tears. She just stood there, a frail figure of dignity desecrated, as the convoy disappeared into the gray distance, leaving only the stench of diesel and the echo of their laughter behind. Word of the incident spread through the small town like wildfire. By the time Sarah had trudged home, peeled off her ruined clothes, and climbed into a hot bath, the phone at the local diner was ringing off the hook. The town was furious. But in a war zone, what could they do? Complain to the base commander? The military had a war to fight. They didn't have time for complaints about horseplay. Sarah, however, didn't complain. She didn't call the base or write a letter to the local paper. She simply went to bed, feeling colder than the rain could ever have made her. The incident wasn't just an act of rudeness, it was a violation. It was a reminder that in a world gone mad with conflict, simple human decency was often the first casualty. The convoy, meanwhile, rolled on, heading for a forward operating base about 20 miles away. The men were still chuckling about the mud incident when they pulled through the gates of the base. The rain had let up, replaced by a thick, clinging fog. The base was a muddy sprawl of tents, vehicles, and exhausted soldiers. As the trucks parked and the men dismounted, They were met by a sight that silenced their laughter. Standing near the command post, leaning against a jeep with his arms crossed over his chest, was a man they all recognized immediately. It wasn't his uniform that gave him away, though his clothes were clean and pressed, a stark contrast to their own filthy state. It was the way he stood. It was the look in his eyes. It was the air of absolute coiled lethality that surrounded him like a force field. His name was John Kincaid. He was a Master Chief, a Navy SEAL, and a living legend. He was also a veteran of more covert operations than the Pentagon would ever admit to, a man who had stared into the abyss so many times, the abyss had blinked first. He was in his late 40s now, his hair more gray than brown, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder choices. He was at this base not for a combat mission, but for a quiet visit to see an old friend, the base commander, before heading back to the States for good. His enlistment was up. The war, for him, was over. Kincaid had heard the laughter from across the base. He had seen the muddy trucks roll in. He had seen the young soldiers, still buzzing with adrenaline, slapping each other on the back. He didn't know the specifics of what had happened, but he knew that kind of laughter. It was the laughter of bullies, of men who had forgotten that the uniform they wore was supposed to represent protection, not persecution. He watched them for a while, a silent statue in the fog. Then, he moved. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he just walked, with a quiet, ground-eating stride that brought him directly into the path of the young corporal from Texas and the burly sergeant who had done the yelling. The sergeant saw him coming first. He recognized the type instantly. He straightened up, his own swagger evaporating like the morning dew. "Afternoon, sir," the sergeant mumbled. Kincaid stopped. He didn't return the greeting. He just looked at them, his eyes moving from face to face, missing nothing. The silence stretched for an uncomfortable 10 seconds. "Who threw the mud?" Kincaid's voice was low and calm, but it carried the weight of absolute command. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. The private who had made the rude gesture suddenly found his boots incredibly interesting. "I asked a question," Kincaid said, his voice dropping even lower. "I'm not going to ask again. Who threw the mud on the woman in town?" The sergeant, trying to salvage some authority, puffed out his chest. "With respect, sir, it was just a bit of fun. An old lady got in the way of the convoy, no harm done." Kincaid stepped closer. He was only an inch or two taller than the sergeant, but at that moment he seemed to tower over him. "No harm done?" he repeated, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper. "You humiliated a civilian, a grandmother, in front of her own neighbors. You made her the object of your pathetic juvenile ridicule." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And you think no harm is done?" He turned his gaze to the young corporal. "You drive a 20-ton truck, son. You are an ambassador of your country, whether you like it or not. That woman you laughed at? She's the reason we're here. She's the heart of this community, and you treated her like garbage." The corporal's face went pale. The bravado was completely gone. Kincaid took a step back, his posture relaxing slightly, but his eyes remaining hard. "You will get in your trucks. You will drive back to that town, and you will find that woman." The sergeant looked confused. "Sir, we have a supply drop scheduled for—" Kincaid cut him off. "Your supply drop can wait. This cannot. You will find her, and when you do, you will apologize. Not a half-hearted sorry. You will look her in the eye and you will tell her you were wrong. You will tell her that your behavior was a disgrace to the uniform you wear." He pointed a finger at each of them in turn. "And then you will ask her what you can do to make it right. If she wants you to wash her car, you'll wash her car. If she wants you to chop wood for a week, you'll chop wood. You will not leave until she tells me, through you, that she has accepted your apology. Do I make myself clear?" The soldiers stood rooted to the spot, stunned. This wasn't a punishment they had expected. It was worse than latrine duty or losing a stripe. It was a confrontation with their own conscience. "Sir, yes, sir!" they stammered in unison. An hour later, the same convoy, now looking far less cocky, rolled back into the town. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and sharp. The soldiers, now covered in mud themselves from the ride, knocked on Sarah Jensen's door. When she opened it, she saw the young men from the trucks, looking miserable and ashamed. Behind them, leaning against a jeep at the end of the path, was John Kincaid. He had followed them to make sure they followed through. The corporal stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly. "Ma'am, Mrs. Jensen, we came to apologize. What we did was... it was wrong. It was disrespectful and cruel. There's no excuse for it." The sergeant stepped up, his face red with genuine shame. "I've got a mother, ma'am. A grandmother, too. If someone did to them what we did to you, I'd want to hurt 'em. We're really, truly sorry." Sarah looked past them at the man by the jeep. Kincaid gave her a slight, respectful nod. She looked back at the boys in front of her. They were just boys, she realized. Scared, arrogant, far from home, but boys nonetheless. A long, slow moment passed. Then, Sarah Jensen did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. "Thank you," she said softly. "It was a very cold, lonely walk home today." The private, the one who had made the rude gesture, spoke up, his voice cracking. "Ma'am, is there anything we can do to help?" Sarah looked at her yard, neglected since David passed. The fence was missing a few slats. The porch needed painting. The flower beds were a mess of weeds. "Well," she said, her smile growing a little wider, "I suppose if you're going to be here anyway, I could use a hand with the fence." For the next 3 hours, the soldiers worked. They fixed the fence, pulled weeds, and swept her porch. The corporal, who had been a carpenter's apprentice before the war, fixed a loose hinge on her front door. They worked in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of penance. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the small house, they finished. Sarah brought out a pitcher of lemonade and some glasses. They stood in her yard, dirty and tired, drinking lemonade. "You have no idea how much this means," Sarah said, looking at them. Just then, John Kincaid walked up the path. He had waited, watching from a distance. He approached Sarah, his hard demeanor completely gone, replaced by a profound gentleness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough, "on behalf of the United States military, I apologize for the actions of these men, and I thank you for your grace. It takes a bigger person to forgive than it does to seek revenge." Sarah looked at him, this warrior with kind eyes. "You're going home, aren't you?" she asked, sensing something. Kincaid nodded. "Yes, ma'am. My war is over." "Mine has been over for a long time," Sarah said. "But sometimes the battles linger. You learn to live with the scars." She looked at the soldiers. "We all do. Thank you for reminding these young men that there's more to life than battle drills and convoy routes. Thank you for reminding them of their humanity." Kincaid didn't reply. He didn't need to. He simply nodded again, turned, and walked away into the gathering dusk, a lone figure disappearing down the muddy road, having won perhaps the most important battle of his career, a battle for a single act of decency.